Well, good morning. What a pleasure to be here. What a pleasure to be here and honor the legacy of Peter Drucker. I think all of us have to acknowledge that we stand on the shoulders of others, and I want to do that also by recognizing this morning Deepa and Gayatri Prahalad, who are here, and my long-term collaborator. We wrote a book, CK and I, back in 1994 called Competing for the Future. And we coined a phrase, denominator management, and argued, like clay, that as long as we're focused there, we are fundamentally stuck. And it's kind of sad to realize that that's still the case. And so what I like to try to do is at least provide one approach on maybe how we get a little bit beyond that problem. And before digging in, I want to be very clear that this is not just theory. I'm going to talk to you about the work, the experience that I and some very bold researchers are doing inside some of the largest and most complex organizations around the world. But with that said, I'd like to argue that the most profound business challenge we face today is how do we build organizations that can change as fast as change itself? How do you build organizations that are adaptable at their core? We are here to talk about the great transformation. And I would guess that if organizations around the world are going to survive the great transformation in whatever form that takes, they're going to have to get a lot better at transforming themselves. Now, it's obvious to all of us that the winds of creative destruction are blowing as never before, that we live in a world that is suddenly hyperkinetic, and that most of our organizations are not up to this challenge. This is not hyperbole. We have the data. We know what's going on. We know that in industry after industry around the world, it's mostly the newcomers who are creating the new market value. We know that earnings volatility has been going up for 40 years. We know the churn rates and industry league tables has been going up. John Hagel and others have written very persuasively about this. And in that environment, the only insurance against irrelevance is to build an evolutionary advantage. Now, how would you know if you had an evolutionary advantage? Well, if you did, you'd never take refuge in denial. You'd rush out to meet the future. You'd capture more than your fair share of new opportunities. You would be relentlessly optimistic. You'd have an advantage in hiring the most dynamic people in the world, and you would change before you have to. And today, very few organizations meet that criteria. What we know is that it usually takes a crisis and a change in top management to reset strategy, to provoke a strategic alignment. And indeed, the way the most sophisticated companies in the world change is not unlike the sort of change you see in poorly governed authoritarian regimes. It's infrequent, it's belated, it's convulsive, and for exactly the same reason, there are very few mechanisms through which bottom-up change can compound. So our goal is, how could we build a self-renewing organization? Now, obviously, you cannot build an evolutionary advantage without an innovation advantage. Innovation is the fuel for renewal. And yet, I would argue, despite 20 or 30 years of rhetoric around innovation, there's not one company out of 100 that has yet made innovation intrinsic and instinctive. And if you want to validate that in your own organization, you can do it in a very simple way. Take a cross-section of employees and ask them three simple questions. First, how have you been trained as a business innovator? Have we made any investment in your creative capital? Number two, if you have an idea, how quickly can you get a small amount of experimental capital and launch something new? And thirdly, are we measuring innovation, inputs, throughputs, the health of the innovation culture? Are we holding every leader responsible for that and attaching that back to compensation? And by those three very simple tests, there are very few organizations, whatever the CEO says, who are truly serious about innovation. And then in turn, you can't build an innovation advantage without an inspiration advantage. If you want an organization that changes before it has to, you have to give people something worth changing for. It's not by accident that Apple's profit per employee is 100 times that of its manufacturing partner, Han Hai Industries. Apple is passionate about humanizing technology. And with any industry ecosystem, share of profits is a function of share of innovation, which in turn is a share of inspiration, of passion. And there we run into an enormous problem. Today around the world, Gallup tells us that only 13% of employees are truly engaged in their work. That is a catastrophe. That is morally and economically untenable. The human capabilities that matter most in the creative economy, initiative, imagination, passion, those capabilities are gifts, and people choose every day. They decide whether they bring them to work or not, and mostly they don't. And the result of that fact is that our organizations, in some very important ways, are less capable than the people inside of them. Our organizations are inertial. Usually takes a crisis to change. They are incremental. Incumbents are seldom the authors of game-changing innovation, and they're uninspiring. That data on employee engagement hasn't changed in 60 years since Douglas McGregor wrote The Human Side of Enterprise. And so in a sense, our organizations are beset by what I might call core incompetencies. So how do we change that? How do we move beyond that? Well, one of the things we have to recognize is that we have a DNA-level problem here. This is something that goes to the very heart of our thinking, our structures, our processes, but it's at that DNA level. You can put a bra on a dog, but that doesn't turn it into Miley Cyrus, right? You can tweak, you can have an idea wiki or a business incubator or anything else. That's not going to change the DNA of our organizations. So if we're really going to solve this problem, my view is that we are going to have to kill bureaucracy. We're going to have to pull it up by its roots. Virtually every large-scale organization around the world is still run on the principles of bureaucracy. Power trickles down, strategy is set at the top, big leaders appoint little leaders, people compete for promotion, rules proliferate, tasks are assigned, managers ensure compliance. That's management 1.0. And modern management is a mashup of two things. It's a mashup of military command structures that go back thousands of years and the disciplines of industrial engineering. Management is the love child of Julius Caesar and Frederick Winslow Taylor. And that's what we're still stuck with. You know, Max Weber, 100 years ago, Max Weber celebrated bureaucracy as being superior to any other form of human organization in its discipline, its stringency, its reliability. All of that is true, but outside of healthcare and education, those organizational virtues are fast becoming table stakes. So yes, bureaucracy allowed us to deliver unprecedented levels of efficiency. Today around the world, 1 billion people can afford an automobile. But all of that came at a terrible cost. We multiplied purchasing power by turning human beings into semi-programmable robots. And as a society, we can no longer afford that maladaptivity. We can no longer afford to squander those human talents. We can't afford the poisonous politicking. We can't afford the inherent conservatism that strangles innovation. We can't afford the creative apartheid. We can't afford the balkanization, the sycophancy, the alienation. Somehow we have to escape that management tax. You know, Max Weber, he rightly viewed bureaucracy as a triumph, but he also viewed it as an iron cage. And he understood that when you come to work as a human being, you surrender your creativity and you become a rule follower. You surrender your agency and you serve the boss. You surrender your interests and slot into a role. And after all that, not much of your humanity is left. So as an organization grows, bureaucratic drag grows even faster. That's an empirical fact. The ratio of managers to employees goes up. Rules proliferate, decision cycles get longer, policies become more formalized, staff groups accumulate more power, and legal has to sign off on everything. And that's the dynamic that turns leaders into laggards. Let me give you just one example of how expensive that can be. A decade ago, 4 of the most powerful technology companies in the world were Intel, Dell, HP, and Microsoft. And yet all 4 of them completely missed the single biggest shift in a generation in their industry, and that was the shift to wireless. The mobile opportunity was not an existential threat to their core business. Like most opportunities, it was more additive than substitutionary. But they all missed it entirely. Intel still makes more than 60% of its profits from the PC. Its mobile division, loss-making division, is 3% of revenues. And when you ask, why does this happen? It happens because we continue to over-concentrate power in our organizations. When you give a few people at the top the power to set strategy and direction, You are giving them the right to hold the organization's capacity to change hostage to their own personal willingness to adapt and change. So the simplest explanation you will ever hear of why successful organizations ultimately fail is this. They fail when the leaders fail to write off their own depreciating intellectual capital. And you saw that happen at Microsoft, many other organizations. Now, I've never met a leader who's a booster for bureaucracy, never. But I haven't met very many who can suggest an alternative. The fact is, most of us are prisoners of precedent. Most of us would struggle to imagine an organization of scale and complexity, of some significant scale and complexity, where there is no formal hierarchy, where there are no titles, no EVPs, SVPs, where the leaders are chosen by the led, where strategy is outsourced to every single employee, where compensation decisions are peer-based, where the span of control is 400 to 1 or greater, or to take one recent example, where an 80,000-person company is divided into 2,000 profit centers. And yet all of those weird practices actually exist. They're going on right now in some of the world's most amazingly successful companies. So why are we still stuck? 60 years ago, Warren Bennis, 60 years ago, he predicted that by now, we would all be living in organic, adaptive structures. I can tell you that's not what it feels like if you work for Delta Airlines, or you work for Tesco, or you work for Samsung, or the French Civil Service, or even a new internet darling like Salesforce.com, which apparently needs 600 vice presidents to deliver $4 billion of revenue. How that could be possible, I don't know. So what is it going to take? I like to suggest it's going to take 4 things to finally put bureaucracy to death. 4 things. It's going to take models, motivation, new mindsets, and migration paths. And let me spend just 1 minute on each one. You know, the good news, let's start with models. The good news is there are plenty of models out there. Favi, Red Hat, Gore, Atlassian, Morningstar, Spotify. There are all kinds of organizations that are learning to manage without managers, if you will. But when you dig into them, you have to understand not their practices, you have to understand the principles. The practice alone, you can't import that. But you look at the principles of openness, transparency, meritocracy, disaggregation, activism, community, and you start to say, how do we rebuild management around a new set of principles? So that's the first, is to dig into those models. Now, to take those models seriously, you really have to have the motivation to start to change the way you lead and manage. And that motivation only comes when you finally admit to yourself that we are up against challenges that lie outside of the old management model, that we really have no alternative. We looked back over 100 years of industrial competition, and what we learned was the most significant shifts in competitive advantage came not from technology innovation or business model innovation, they came from innovation and management that fundamentally extended human capabilities. We need a lot more of that. I think the third thing is we're going to have to change some mindsets. One of the reasons it's been so difficult, we looked at dozens of examples over the last 50 years where we've tried to rehumanize work. Many of these examples were amazingly successful, incredible business results, but very few survived. They were rare and they were transient, and we asked why. Why, when you have all these advantages, do we revert back to that hierarchical, rule-driven kind of organization? And I think the answer is, as managers, we have a lot of vestigial, residual beliefs that were handed down to us by long-dead CEOs, by ego-polishing consultants, by backward-looking scholars. And so we have to challenge those toxic mindsets that people are instruments, that efficiency matters most, that emotions are suspect, that change has to be managed. So why most managers wouldn't admit to having those beliefs, trust me, they do. So we have to identify how those get played out in everyday processes, decisions, and then we have to weed them out. Thirdly, we need some migration paths. Most of the management vanguard are greenfield organizations. They were built kind of with a post-bureaucratic model from the beginning. Like Lady Gaga, they were kind of born that way. But if you have a brownfield organization, that's a much bigger problem. Now you have to retrofit a lot of that old management model. And you can't do that by going to your senior staffers and asking them to reimagine how you lead and manage and organize. Going to HR, finance, asking them to do this work, it's like asking turkeys to vote for Christmas. Not going to happen. So instead, I would argue we need a purposeful, disciplined, creative approach to hacking management. What does that mean? It means you open up a company-wide conversation and you ask people, where do you see the evidence of bureaucratic drag? How much is this costing us? What are the new principles we might need to build our management model around? If we took those principles seriously, what would change? If we were serious about openness, for example, what would change in how we share compensation data? What would we change in the way we create strategy? And then you ask people to take that idea, put it into a little experiment, something that can be run low cost, low risk, and see whether it works or not. I believe the organizations that win over the next few years are going to be the ones that evolve their management models faster than their competitors. And to do that, we're simply going to have to experiment more. Now, I like just to end by saying this. I think one of the things that's hampered us in this work, one of the things that hampered us is really we've been hampered by our own ADD. We've been hampered by a kind of ambition deficit disorder. And we believe that as good as Intel or Google or whoever it is, Netflix, as good as they're managing right now, that's as good as it's ever going to be. So we end up fiddling at the margins. We take a layer or two out, but the hierarchy is still there. We celebrate the empowerment, but we don't let people choose their own leaders. We celebrate innovation, but we fund it more like the Soviet Union than Silicon Valley. And so when I moved 21 years ago, when I moved back from London to Silicon Valley, I started hanging out with people from Stanford, people from the engineering school who are working on nanoscale manufacturing, people from computer science who are building machines that think, people from the medical school that were working on solutions to genetic maladies. And it struck me, they were all madly, madly ambitious for what could be. And I thought to myself, you know, the job of management researchers, the job of management scholars isn't merely to wrap clever theories around observed realities. Our job is to change those realities, not merely to codify what is there, but to change it and to create. You know, without doubt, the most important invention of the last 150 years was the invention of management. The tools, the methods we use to mobilize and organize resources to productive ends. It is literally the technology of human accomplishment. And the problems that we can solve as a species is fundamentally limited by our capacity to manage, to bring people together, to coordinate, to accomplish things at scale. And I'm arguing that today, that technology has to be reinvented, root and branch. It is a problem that I think is so urgent, so complex, and so eminently worthwhile that none of us who have a stake in the future of humanity should be sitting on the sidelines. Thank you.